Okay. I love waiting room music, so sorry you had to sit through that, but here we are. Again, thank you all for joining. We are happy to be joined by some experts in the field, and we are excited to have this conversation with you all. We've enjoyed two really good conversations about both 2066 and 2117 earlier this week. Today we are talking about I-2109, and tomorrow we'll be covering walk hairs with 2104, 2124. So just to give you a brief overview of the program, we are going to talk about cap gains, and then we're going to talk about I-2109, obviously. We're going to hear personal testimony from our panelists, and then we're going to go ahead and open up the floor for questions. So if, while you're listening, something pops up, you can go ahead and drop a question into the Q&A chat below, but I see many of the people that have already joined us for earlier on our two other sessions this week. So you guys totally get it. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it right over to Representative Chris Corey to kick us off.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate everyone for joining us today. I'm Representative Chris Corey, serving in the 14th District, which is Yakima and Klickitat counties. Excited to be with you here to share a little bit about why this initiative should pass and why it will not have the dramatic impacts that some of the opponents of the initiative have been claiming. First and foremost, a little bit of background about me. I've been in the legislature since 2019. Since 2020, I've been on the House Appropriations Committee. And starting last year, I became the ranking Republican in the House Appropriations Committee. And that committee deals with the state's operating budget. Basically, most of the money that goes out that's not building a building or paving and fixing a road comes through our committee. And I can tell you, we have enough money to pass this initiative and fund government. We actually did a deep dive earlier in the year with nonpartisan staff, and we've seen both dramatic increases in revenue collections over the last 11 years to the tune of about 111%. State spending that's more than doubled in that same time, and that's due to a number of indicators. A lot of it has to do with just great entrepreneurs in our state. We've got an amazing ag, tech, manufacturing. We lead in so many areas, and that's been richly rewarded, which means the state has been naturally collecting more revenues. And so, unfortunately, it's not enough for politicians in Olympia. They want more. They want more. And they think that it's their money. They're entitled to it. And the cap gains was one way to get it. Now, it's interesting to note that when the capital gains, quote unquote, excise tax was passed, it was aimed only at those super wealthy, right? This is only going to impact those that are making so much more money. It'll never impact the average Joe, and it's going to support really good causes. And we know for a fact that that's not their plan, that the plan for this is to grow and change. Actually, during that debate, Public Records unveiled emails from Democrats saying that their plan was to use this to get a progressive income tax. They wanted a full-on income tax that the state has never had, that voters and citizens have roundly and routinely rejected. But in this case, they thought this would be a way to end run around our state constitution, which has that prohibition on progressive taxes on property, and income is property. Despite what anyone may think, they wanted to change that, but it's true. Your income is your property. It seems like common sense for me to say that, but that's the argument we're having right now. So they passed this as an excise tax, as a workaround the Constitution, which obviously is shameful in and of itself, but was unfortunately upheld by the state Supreme Court for, let's just say less than constitutionally scholarly reasons in our state constitution. And so once that was upheld, it really unleashed the floodgates. And so while the claims are this is only going to only going to affect the super rich and it's going to help everyone, the truth couldn't be further from the truth. For one, we know that they've offered to lower that threshold down to 15,000 from 250,000, which means far more people would be subject to this tax. Additionally, another proposal that they proposed that same year was to actually use this tax on incomes, and they wanted to charge an excise tax on certain employees' paychecks. So it's not an income tax. We're doing an excise tax on your payroll check because you're earning so much money. Again, these are all things that they have signaled that they want to do. And if this initiative is not passed, that will be the game plan to continue to lower that threshold, to increase those different areas that they're going to apply that to, which means more and more Washingtonians will be impacted by this tax. And I brought up my appropriations background in the beginning because I want to make it clear we don't need the money. If you were to pass this initiative alone and all the initiatives, we would go back to a budget from 2 years ago. So we're not talking about losing millions and billions of dollars. What we're talking about is going back to an already historic budget from 2 years ago. Olympia over the last 6 years has had $19 billion in surplus. We're the only state in the country that has not provided any broad-based tax relief since the pandemic. We're trailing behind states like California and New York. The truth is, we do not have a revenue problem in this state. We have a spending problem. It is functionally that we are spending too much money in too many different places. One of the last thing I'll end before we hear from our other guests, who are far more entertaining than I am, was that we actually looked at what could we do? Could we handle passing this initiative and still fund all these priorities? And the answer is yes. We actually had nonpartisan research staff go out and help us figure out what kind of budget we could put together if we pass this initiative. And I'm happy to report we can actually pass this initiative and fund everything within existing resources, which means less money coming out of our economy, which means more jobs for us locally, um, which basically means just better living for those in Washington State. So I want you to have all that. I want you to be armed with that. I'm going to put some links in the chat here if I can, so you can see that for yourself, because it is up to you on this call to share this information with people. There is a lot of fear mongering going on in the public right now about how this is going to hurt people. And I know myself and others like VJ on the call have been spending time, arming people with the facts so that you can tell people why they should vote yes and not have to worry about state resources at our schools. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend VJ.
Hi guys, my name is VJ Boyapati, and firstly, I just want to say thank you to Representative Corey and also Marcus, who's joining me. He's a prolific entrepreneur in Seattle. I feel very honored to be in the company of these guys. I wanted to tell you a little bit about my background, why I'm interested in this. You can probably tell from my accent that I was born and raised in Australia. I came to the United States almost a quarter of a century ago to do a PhD in computer science. I didn't start the PhD. I ended up at a small startup that was called Google. And Google obviously grew into one of the largest companies on earth. And we built one of the most valuable services on earth that's used by billions of people every day. When Google went public, I suddenly had a lot of wealth on paper because a lot of people in tech get a lot of their compensation in the form of stock. And actually, people who work in tech often take a lot of risk to do this. They'll reduce their salary and they'll take more stock because they believe in the mission of the company that they're building. So I had a decision at the time whether I wanted to stay in California and pay very large state income tax on top of the federal capital gains tax that I would pay if I sold any Google shares, or move somewhere else that I viewed as not punishing success. And 18 years ago, I decided to move to Washington and settle in Seattle. And I really strongly believe that Washington has one of the most vibrant technology centers in the whole world because we used to have great incentives for people to move here. And I like to bring up the example of Amazon. And it's well known that Amazon was founded in Washington because we used to have very business-friendly policies and we didn't have an income tax. And I like to think, what would Washington have looked like if we didn't have Amazon here? We wouldn't have hundreds of thousands of well-paid employees and the whole ecosystem around them of other businesses that support people who work at Amazon, restaurants, dry cleaners, people who build daycare businesses. We would have lost a lot by not having Amazon here. So what the capital gains tax does, I believe, is it creates a very strong incentive for people to leave the state who have a lot of capital gains, but it also creates a big disincentive of people moving to Washington, people who are thinking about, well, I want to start a business, where should I go? Should I go to Florida or should I go to Texas? People in tech are very mobile and they have these choices, and these questions are very important to them. I think what we're going to do is we're going to push away people who would have thought about Washington as an attractive place to start their business. So, we have hundreds of thousands of people who work in tech in Washington, and this is going to affect them. the tax has been marketed to everyone as a tax on rich people, but we know this is not true. Within 1 year of creating the tax, the politicians in Olympia started pushing for the threshold at which it applies to be dropped from 250,000 down to 15,000. So this tax is really going to apply to everyone. One last thing I wanted to say is I really don't think it's correct to call this a tax on rich people. Not a tax on being rich, it's a tax on becoming rich. And I think it's really unfair that, these ultra billionaires who've already made their wealth over the last 30 or 40 years, people like Bill Gates, and they didn't pay any sales tax, they're now making it harder for small business owners, for tech employees, for startup founders to become wealthy. And we should all support people being successful. So, I think we need to repeal this capital gains tax for a few reasons. It creates this huge disincentive for businesses to be founded here, and it really punishes people who have success. So I would like to urge everyone to vote yes on I-2109 and get rid of this backdoor income tax. We know what the politicians in Olympia are going to do. Now that the door is open, they're going to expand the net of people who this applies to. They're going to increase the rate, and slowly but surely over time, just as they've said in their private correspondence, this is going to turn into an income tax. So I'm also happy to answer questions about this and talk a bit more about my background in tech, but I want to hand it over to Marcus, who's one of our great entrepreneurs in Seattle. Marcus, I think you are muted.
Oh, thank you. How's about now?
You're good now. Thanks, Marcus.
Great. Yeah, I want to echo VJ and Chris. Thank you so much for all the things that you've done in our community. And I have some similar, concerns as well. But I also kind of wanted to bring a small business perspective to the conversation, because when you look at the intent of how this was passed, it wasn't passed by a supermajority. It was the pandemic. It was literally the middle of the night. And you can look at the industries that were exempted from the tax to see how much political capital it actually cost to get the door kicked open on income tax. And so when you look at the four biggest and even the fifth smallest industry to be completely excluded from this tax, meaning that they don't have to pay it in their businesses, it becomes really surprising. So real estate is not taxed. Car dealerships, when you sell a car dealership, you're not taxed. If you're a warehouser or any other large landholder that's not using your real estate as a function of production, but as a function of holding real estate for trees. So all the REITs that hold timber and tree, they can trade their real estate back and forth with each other for hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're not affected by this tax. Fishing rights. So, the mom and pop fisherman who sells their boat to their offspring. Great. I'm glad that's not taxed. But Trident is the largest seafood manufacturer in the Northwest, if not North America. They can sell their businesses and their fishing rights for hundreds of millions of dollars. They're not taxed. And so what happened is that the income tax or the capital gains tax was actually only allowed through the midnight backdoor vote because those industries got exempted. And what didn't happen was that the small businesses were excluded. So, not to take anything away from VJ's, tech software folks that are coming here and making these great big businesses. But, let's say you have a small plumbing shop, and that plumber's got, 2 or 3 trucks, and he employs 2 or 3 people, but he wants to grow, and he wants to have 5 trucks, and he wants to employ a couple other people. Well, he needs to raise capital. And the way you raise capital is you sell stock in your own business to reinvest that capital. So if he goes to a family office or a private equity or somewhere else and says, hey, I'll sell you 50% of my 3 plumbing trucks, and you give me $500,000 that I'm going to put back into my business, he's now taxed on 250 of that $500,000 in income that he doesn't actually get. The IRS calls that phantom income. because it's a phantom. It doesn't happen, right? So now he's going to owe that money. That's less money he's putting into his business. That's one less truck that he can now buy. And you can scale that example any number of ways. So when you say, hey, it's okay to tax the techie, but we're not going to tax Vulcan on a $250 million asset sale of a building because it's real estate, or we're not going to tax, one of the big families that owns car dealerships that sell 4 or 5 car dealerships at a time for 50, 60 million bucks. We're not going to tax them either. It really shows that this isn't about a particular wealth status. This is actually about trying to get this backdoor income tax in, and that will hurt all of us. And the hundreds of thousands of people work in tech, millions of Washingtonians work for small business, like millions and millions. And so all those people are affected by phantom income concerns that are a direct result of capital gains that the owners and investors of those businesses are going to pay and have been paying for the last 12 to 18 months. So I believe this really affects Washingtonians from the most wealthy, down to the folks who work in those plumbing trucks out 6, 7 days a week, earning a decent living, but could be making more if there wasn't phantom income. So yeah, I'm happy to spend more time and answer questions. And I'm not a super awesome public speaker, so sorry if that was a little bit garbled.
No way. It was perfect. And thank you so much to all three of you for sharing your perspective and just kind of illuminating this issue in a way that makes sense to lots of people. We appreciate you sharing. We are going to open up the floor for questions now. We have one that's come in during those presentations, and I'm going to direct it to Representative Corey. It's a two-parter question. So the first part is, we hear all the time, and we kind of briefly talked about it here, that this is just a tax on the wealthy. It doesn't apply to me. Why does this matter? I shouldn't care about this. This isn't pertaining to me at all. So if you could speak to that piece. And then the question that we just received, I'll just read it out so everybody hears it. Your campaign mentions that this capital gains tax is morphing into a progressive income tax. However, the legislature passed Let's Go Washington's I-2111 this year, which prohibits an income tax. So that's explicitly on the books as law. This may have been the plan initially, but based on documents on our campaign site, doesn't this new legislation mean it's no longer an issue?
So great question. Still an issue. Again, the way they have defined this tax goes against 49 other states and the IRS. They're calling it an excise tax. So while we are in state law with 2111 saying, here's the definition of an income tax, separately, we're saying, nope, this is an excise tax. So the comments we heard when it was passed by some members of the legislature on the House floor, basically they were like, this isn't going to do anything. So yeah, vote yes. And obviously we disagree. We think that there is meaning to how the feds classify a tax as an income tax versus not. The threat is still here that they will turn this into a general income tax by a different name, right? So we are now, like Seattle has a head tax, right? Or an excess compensation tax. So they could look at doing that. So whereas they may say, well, your first person, if you're making 20,000 a year, obviously that's not excess compensation. But if you're at 50,000, you're now going to pay an excise tax on any earnings over that. And we're going to use it to fund X, Y, or Z. That's really the only limiting factor between a generalized income tax, which can go into a general fund and go anywhere, to a program tax. Like if you think about another initiative we're talking about is the long-term care tax. They could try to tie an excise tax to something and say, well, we're going to fund it this way with a progressive excise tax. So the idea here is obviously, one, we want to protect, Washington's competitive advantage, something that our state bragged about in our official state websites, and it drew people here. Jeff Bezos was mentioned earlier, but there's plenty of other ones that aren't as big name, but still have a big impact on our economy and our region. But also the idea that we want to make it clear that this state is not going to continue to go down this rabbit hole of just expanding taxes anytime they want to do something rather than living within their fiscal means.
Awesome. Thank you for that answer. VJ, I do want to ask a question just to you a little bit more about kind of the tech industry. I don't know, I didn't have a very comprehensive understanding of how this affected them prior to starting this, and you've definitely helped kind of clarify that as well. So maybe just for viewers, just a little bit more of an understanding about how exactly the tech industry is impacted by cap gains, and what I know you've been having lots of conversations with them. What kind of their general thoughts are on this tax?
Yeah, so for people in tech, this is really very close to an income tax because people who work in tech usually get a part of their compensation, often a very large part of their compensation in the form of stock. And the reason they get that is because we believe in building something that's, valuable and helps a lot of people. That's what Google was or is, for instance. It's a service used by billions of people. Uh, what I found really interesting, I was very curious how people felt about this in the tech industry because the tech industry is generally very liberal, and I was really worried about the impact this tax would have on our state and the growth of the tech industry in our state. So I went to Microsoft and Amazon and just walked around asking people, and what shocked me was that most, or a lot of people, I should say, didn't even know that this tax existed. And I think part of that is by design. They wanted to create a tax to open the door, basically a backdoor income tax, and they marketed it initially as just applying to the wealthy. And then we see their intent is to reduce the threshold at which it applies from 250,000 down to 15. I think they'll drop it all the way down to, 1,000. So it's effectively a tax on anyone who has any assets. And I think they're going to expand the pool of assets too, from just stocks and bonds and cryptocurrencies to things like real estate as well. I think eventually it's going to apply to everything. So I spoke to people at Amazon and Microsoft, and firstly, most of them didn't seem to know that this tax existed. And when I explained it, people were pretty upset and they realized that it would have a big impact on them. And so part of this, I think, is an education campaign, is letting people know how it will apply to them and not allowing a tax like this to be sort of snuck in by the legislature. And I think, Washington has had this long tradition of not having an income tax because we had a constitutional protection against it. And unfortunately, what's happened is we have a Supreme Court that's become very politicized and has classified this as not an income tax as it's defined everywhere else in every state that has it. By the federal government, it's as is an income tax. In the dictionary, it's an income tax. Everyone knows this is an income tax, but we have a Supreme Court that twisted the definition because they're on board with this political agenda to get an income tax in Washington. Uh, so the trick was to say start out by saying it's just for rich people, and to say it's not an income tax. We know both of these things are false. And I really think we need to get the message out on this, especially in places like the tech industry where people are going to be very impacted by this new tax on their stock compensation, and let them know that, this is going to be a big hit. It effectively increases their tax burden on their stock sales by almost 50%. And that's a dramatic increase. So I was surprised that people didn't know about it. And, the thing I want to communicate to the wider community is people in tech, they take more risk by taking a lower salary and getting stock compensation. So this really does matter to them.
Thank you, VJ. That's super helpful. Um, Representative Corey, we're going to go back to you. The question was, will voting yes on this initiative gut public education funding and early childcare? Our education funding is such a mess. It's hard to understand what's going on at the state level.
So great question. Obviously, I think one of the points that the opponents are bringing up, and I think it's not true. This is not going to gut public education. So first and foremost, this money goes into kind of a generalized fund that gets spread out over a lot of areas, the first $500 million in any given year. And it's important to note that our first year, the estimated returns, like what we thought was coming in, was really high. The numbers were coming in really high. And every time since then, we've had to adjust them back down because it turns out a lot of things that people thought may be subject to it because it's so unclear, it's very new and novel, this idea weren't. And so those numbers got revised down from people's estimated taxes. And also we started seeing what we predicted, which was people leaving the state to avoid these transactions, going to where they're going to, not have to pay a very high tax rate on some of their transactions, and that's getting to lower it down and down and down. Again, we've had another revision down again this year. So it's important to note that like capital gains taxes are the most volatile taxes that you can have, and they are something you should never fund core services on because they vary so much. And you don't have to take that from Washington State. You can actually go look at California, and they've had huge problems with up and downs because of the volatility of capital gains. So the first 500 million goes into this account that's spent on a plethora of things. And then if there's excess after that, it goes into a school construction account. No money is going to school construction from this because it's well below that threshold. So to my point, I bring that back to this. We've had year after year of surplus revenues, $1 billion or more in any given year. We could replace that cap gains and fund it within existing surplus revenues or other programs without impacting public education. Which, to your second part of your question, is yes, it's a mess. McCleary is was solved, but now we've kind of made some changes in the legislature, so now there's probably opening more problems down the road. Currently, it's about 48% of our total budget. So there is some room for growth there. I know that there are ways, again, it's a fiscal priorities. What are the core services of state government? And if education is our primary duty as in our state constitution, then that should be job number one, and that should get the priority, and you can fund that. So there really doesn't need to be a political need for us to pit public education as a threat to not supporting tax increases. And that's kind of what I think I see is a lot of, I guess, emotional appeal saying we're going to gut public education. And that's just simply not true.
Good answer.
Hallie, could I make a
yeah.
quick comment on what
Absolutely.
Representative Corey said? The Seattle Times recently published an op-ed on I-2109, and they said, we can't find anyone who's left the state. Let me tell you that I have several friends who have left Washington because it would have a big, big impact on them. One of my friends has 3 young children who he raised in Washington, lived here for 15 years, and this was going to have a big impact. He has moved to Miami. All of the contributions he would make to our state, the philanthropy that he would bring to our city, that's all gone. And that's a huge loss for our state. We should be celebrating bringing talented people to our state, and we shouldn't be driving them away. So this idea that there isn't anyone leaving is really, it's nonsense.
And the Seattle Times posted an article about how the wealthy are leaving the state in droves as of very recently. So, I mean, there's evidence abounding, and they've written about it extensively.
That guy that left Amazon, founded Amazon, Bezos, is that his name? I'm not really familiar with it. Did a very public declaration and moved because that's what you required to prove your domicile change. Department of Revenue looks for that. And then almost as soon as that was all done, moving to Florida, sold billions of dollars of assets that could have been used for philanthropy in our state, but now they're completely gone. Yes, people are moving. It's been very public. So, and it's obviously the big guys are the ones that make headlines, but there's lots of small people that are going away quietly.
Yeah, definitely. We've got time for one more question after this one. Marcus, I am going to send this one to you. You spoke a lot about the kind of the small business side of things and obviously those exemptions that you were talking about. I'm curious if obviously the cap gains income tax is new. If you had known that this was kind of the trajectory that Washington State was on, do you think that would have had any impact on deciding to be in Seattle and start businesses? Just kind of talking again to that piece about people leaving the state because of this tax.
I mean, I hate hypotheticals because, and let's face it, I'm older. I'm 50 now. So that was a long time ago. I started my first business when I was 23 years old. So, but I can tell you what I'm doing now. And I'm not looking at any Washington deals. If someone's going to ask, if I'm going to invest in a small business, whether that be a restaurant, a nightclub, a plumbing business, any of those sorts of things, I don't touch any Washington deals. I only look, frankly, in Florida and in Texas, because that's where I think that the growth is going to happen. And you can look at Austin, that the city is booming. And why? It's because if you're a tech person, you're like, hey, do I want to be in Washington or do I want to be in Texas? They're going Texas. And if you're starting a plumbing business, you're going to go plumb houses where the houses are getting built. So you're going to go to Texas. Florida, all those hurricanes, it's horrible. And we can have an environmental discussion about it, but the reality is Florida's booming. And we've doing a disservice to ourselves out of a political ideology that's a win at all costs kind of basis, and it's a shame. So no, if you're looking to open a restaurant in Seattle, I'm not your guy, and that's what I can say wholeheartedly.
Thank you so much for that answer. And I don't like hypotheticals either, so it did hurt me to pose that to you, but I appreciate your honesty. Last question is for Representative Corey. I'm just going to read this whole thing because it's a little, there's some framing to the question, actually. I saw that nearly 2-to-1 voters agreed with overturning this capital gains tax in a poll last summer, including in Seattle. However, when the actual ballot language was used in a more recent poll, which includes that overturning it will impact funding for childcare and education, way more people were against it. Do you think it's unfair to include that framing language on the ballot? And why do you think so many people were in favor of it without that language?
So I think it's definitely framing. In politics and campaigning, there's what we call a push poll, where you ask questions that can tend to be leading, and this is one of them. This was a legislative response. I voted against it by lawmakers in Olympia who don't like the initiative process, especially if it goes against their preferred narrative, right? And so they have a partisan office write these. And surprise, surprise, a majority party is against something, and you have a very negatively written out partisan thing. So yes, it is absolutely framing, because it is a way to cut at the initiative process because, frankly, it's very unpopular from out of touch people in Olympia who think they know better than the average citizen.
Great way to wrap it up. I do want to say thank you again to Representative Corey, VJ, and Marcus for joining us, and thank you to everybody that watched. We will have this webinar available on our YouTube channel shortly, and yeah, we're just excited to have one more conversation tomorrow. And a reminder to everybody to vote yes and pay less with I-2109. Thanks so much, everybody.